Welcome to the video lecture where I will be covering the rest of Chapter 8 that we did not get a chance to cover in class. So first we'll start by talking about families. We know that when we look at families, the most important aspect of a family is looking at the parent-child relationship. We see that the time spent together decreases across mid to late childhood, that parents are really spending about half as much time with their children as they did when they were younger. However, it's important to understand that even though they're not spending as much time with their children anymore, that they still play a very important role in the development of that particular child. So for example, even though they're not spending as much time together, parents are still ultimately making the decisions about the child's education as well as about the child's activities and what they're doing. All right, so the parent is deciding, oh, well, I'm going to send my child to this particular school, or that they're going to participate in certain activities. We also know that the nature of punishment changes across mid to late childhood. We see that in early childhood we're using things like maybe age-appropriate spanking, or maybe we're using things like timeout. But as the children progress through mid to late childhood, we're more likely to use things like withholding privileges, like taking away their cell phone or not allowing them to watch television. Or we appeal to things like guilt. Right? We say, oh, I'm so disappointed in you. How could you possibly break my trust like that? We also see that as children move through mid to late childhood, they're granted more autonomy or more independence from their parents. That parents are allowing their children to have more control and are able to regulate themselves as an individual more. We see, however, that this autonomy doesn't all come at once, that it's more of a gradual progression where we give kids a little bit more autonomy here and there. And parents act more as managers for their children, so they're not regulating them on a moment-to-moment basis anymore, but they're still managing things like their schedule, like structuring the household in a certain way, so parents are acting more in that capacity. We also see that attachment is still important here. We saw attachment first when we talked about infancy, and we said that there are different styles of attachment. And we see that for kids who are securely attached to their parents when they were infants, that here in mid to late childhood, that they're more likely to be able to regulate their emotions better, and they're less likely to suffer from anxiety or depression. Now, in terms of families, we see that there are different family structures. So, for example, with step families, we see certain statistics. So, for example, we see that for about half of children who experience their parents' divorce, half of them, right, for half of those families, they will end up with a step parent in the household within 4 years of the original divorce. We also see that remarriages are more likely to end in divorce than first marriages. In fact, they're 10 times more likely to do so. One of the reasons why that might be is because people who remarry clearly went through a divorce before, and so they are more likely to be open to getting a divorce. All right, we see that there are different step-family structures. The first are simple structures. Now these are when we introduce either a stepfather or a stepmother into the family. So with the stepfather family, we see that the mother has primary custody of her children from her first marriage, and she introduces a stepfather to them. In the other, we see that the father has custody of his children and introduces a stepmother to the mix. We also see that there's something called a blended or complex step-family structure, where both the mother and the father bring a family, or bring their children from their previous family into this new remarriage. So the Brady Bunch is a pretty dated example where the mother brings her children in and the father brings his children in, and they both have to sort of mix. Now when we look at which type of step-family structure results in more difficult adjustment, it's obvious to see that a blended or complex family would be harder to adjust to, because there are a lot more people and a lot more relationships that need to be renegotiated. However, overall, the majority of children who experience this transition into a step family adjust just fine. right? So in addition to the importance of family, we see that peers are important too. In terms of how peer relationships change across childhood, we see that peers become more important as children move across childhood. Because they're spending less time with their parents, they're spending more time with their friends. We also see that as we move across childhood, that there is a preference for same-sex friends until we reach the age of 12. And we'll talk more about that when we hit adolescence. Now, some of the research that has looked at peers and peer relationships looks at what's called sociometric status. Now, during sociometric status studies, what we do is we ask children in the classroom, who are your best friends in the class? And who are the people that you like the least in the class? Right, so what we find is that there are different statuses that come from this. All right, popular students are more likely to be rated as people's best friend, and they're not as likely to be rated as someone who's disliked by anyone. Now, when we look at the characteristics of popular kids, we see that they tend to be pretty happy, and that if they do experience negative emotions, they're good at regulating those emotions. We also see that they tend to be concerned with other people. They have good social skills, and they tend to be self-confident without being conceited. All right, we also see that there are some students who are rated on average, so they receive an average number of best friend ratings and an average number of times when they're reported as being disliked. All right, we also see that there are neglected students in the class. Now, these students are not really named as anyone's best friend, but they're also not named as someone who's disliked by anyone. It's sort of like they're invisible. We also see that there are some students who are actively rejected. That means they're rated as someone that people dislike a lot, and they're not really nominated or not really named as people's best friends. Now, students who are rejected, they're more likely to have problems with their attention, okay? They don't have very good sustained attention. They tend to be more impulsive, and they tend to have a harder time regulating their emotions. So this means that when they have interactions with their peers, they're not very good interactions with their peers because of these problems, which may explain why they're more likely to feel rejected. Lastly, we have controversial students. These are students who are rated very often as being someone's best friend, but are also named often as someone that someone doesn't like. So they're very well liked, but they're also actively disliked, which is why they're a little bit controversial. Now, when we look at peers, we also see that bullying is a big issue that comes up here in elementary and middle school. We see that 1/3 of kids are involved in bullying as either the victim of the bullying or as the bullier. So that's quite a number of kids that are involved with this. We also see that when we look at who is more likely to be bullied, we see that boys are more likely than girls to be bullied. And when we look at the age group that's most likely to be bullied, it's mostly early middle school children. Okay, so those in the early middle school years. And I've always felt like middle school is like the hotbed for bullying. We see that bullies also tend to have a higher social status. Okay, we would like to think that our kids would reject the bullies, but they don't necessarily do so. A really good example of this is in the movie Mean Girls. Okay, so the queen bee, Regina, she is very much a bully to a lot of people. However, Regina has high social status. So now backing up a second, trying to define what bullying is. Okay, bullying can be either a physical or a verbal action that's meant to harm someone of a lower social status, okay, of someone who has less power. And so Regina would definitely fall under that because she uses verbal behaviors to really hurt others who are of lower social status than her. But it can be physical bullying too, where kids are, beating up another child, again, as a way to show power over someone who has lower social status. So the outcomes of bullying, we see that kids who are bullied have poorer health, right? They tend to get sick more. Maybe they have stomach issues. We also see that their psychological health has been impacted. They're more likely to suffer from anxiety and depression, as well as are more likely to commit suicide. We also see that bullying does not necessarily have to take place face-to-face, that we can have cyberbullying, which is where these activities of bullying, a verbal sort of activity here, to undermine someone of a lower social status is taken online. So we see that this takes place on social media sites like Facebook or Instagram, where people post mean comments, say mean things, or maybe spread rumors about another person online, or maybe post embarrassing photos or stories about a person online. And of course, the outcomes of cyberbullying are the same as face-to-face bullying too. All right, so when we look at peers here, we see that friends are really important, and that friends are mostly similar to one another, right? That saying, birds of a feather flock together, is definitely true here. We see that friends tend to be more similar in gender, in age, in activities they like to do, in their values and beliefs, and in terms of their race. We see that friendships are beneficial for everyone, okay, but for kids in this age group in particular, they provide them with someone to have fun with, they provide some support for them, they provide them people that they can compare themselves with. So overall, friendships are very beneficial. However, not all friendships are created equal. Okay, sometimes we have friendships that don't support us, that make us feel bad about ourselves, that maybe lead us to make poor decisions, and those are not beneficial friendships. We also see that intimacy in friendships may not appear until adolescence, okay? Children's friendships usually center around activities, so they may not have the sharing and intimacy and deep bond that adolescents may share with their friends. All right, and lastly, I want to talk a little bit about schools. And there are two types of approaches when we're talking about schooling: constructivist and direct instruction approaches. With the constructivist approach, it's more learner-centered, where children are encouraged to collaborate with one another. It's very Vygotskian, this idea that we construct knowledge socially. And the teacher is more the guide on the side, helping to facilitate interactions between students, answering any questions that they may have. But really, the teacher doesn't take center stage here. Some of the critiques here, however, of the constructivist approach are that there is not enough emphasis on content, that kids don't always learn everything that they're meant to learn in constructivist schools, and that the approach here is very vague. There's no direct structure here to a constructivist approach. Direct instruction, however, is more teacher-centered, where the teacher really has control of the classroom and they maximize student learn time. So the emphasis here is on teaching as much content as possible. We also see that the teacher is the sage on the stage, that the teacher is really the person who is transmitting this knowledge to the students. Now, the critiques here of the direct instruction approach are that that there's really this emphasis on passive learning, that students aren't engaged with the material, and that they don't emphasize critical thinking in this approach. Now, when we look at these two approaches, we see that the best approach is really a combination of the two, and it really depends on what is being taught. In some subjects, we just have to learn the materials, and so direct instruction may be better there. But in other subjects, we have a little bit more leeway to emphasize more critical thinking, and perhaps a constructivist approach is going to be better there. Now, last topic that we'll cover here is about schools and how to make them accountable, because schools are really charged with teaching material. So how do we make sure that our schools are actually doing that? One way that we do this is through state-mandated testing, but there are pros and cons attached with them. The people who think that state-mandated testing is good believe that it helps keep standards high, that it makes schools accountable because they must teach certain material. However, on the con side, they say, look, just teaching material on the test does not emphasize critical thinking, does not emphasize creative thinking, or measure student engagement. And that this is only one way that schools are doing their job, and so that we need to consider other ways to do this. All right, thank you very much for watching, and please come and see me if you have any questions.